Okay, good evening, everyone, to our Transatlantic Tuesday tonight. Please make sure to leave your microphones turned off during the talk to ensure a good audio quality for everyone. You may or may not leave your cameras on for Torrey and I to see some friendly faces. If you wish, you can decide that for yourselves. Please note that we will be recording this talk. However, your names and faces will not be visible in the recording, so no worries if you decided to leave your cameras turned on. It will not show on the recording. My name is Sabine Pavletta, and I am program manager at the Carl-Schurz-Haus, the German-American Institute in Freiburg, Germany, on whose behalf I'd like to welcome all of you tonight. In our Transatlantic Tuesday series, we regularly invite you into our digital event space to join us live from the comfort of your own home as we discuss current transatlantic issues with renowned experts from Germany, the US, and also other parts of the world. Tonight, we will take a closer look at a foreign policy issue. We will be focusing on the relationship between the US and China and what role Europe will play in the competition between the two superpowers under the Biden administration. With regard to his country's relationship with China, Biden recently announced, quote unquote, extreme competition. And with a close eye on both major powers, other countries are now watching closely to see to what extent the new US administration will follow the hard line taken by Donald Trump in its dealings with China or take a rather different course. And we are delighted to welcome one of the leading experts in the field of European and transatlantic studies, who will help us contextualize and understand Joe Biden's agenda in this regard. Welcome, Torrey Taussig. And before I hand over to you, I'd like to introduce you briefly to our audience tonight, if I may. Dr. Torrey Taussig is the research director for the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship and the American Secretaries of State Project at Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center on the United States and Europe. In 2019 and 20, Taussig directed a joint project between Harvard Kennedy School and the German Council on Foreign Relations to revive and strengthen the transatlantic relationship. The project convened a group of experts and former government officials from the United States and Europe and culminated in a major report titled Stronger Together, a Strategy to Revitalize Transatlantic Power, which was published in December 2020. And my colleague Felicitas will share the link in the chat for those of you who would like to have a closer look at it later after the talk, maybe. In 2018 and 2019, Taussig was a Robert Bosch Foundation Fellow based in Berlin, Germany, where she served as a foreign policy advisor in the German Bundestag and in the Transatlantic Division of the German Foreign Office. During that time, she researched and published on US-Europe relations, German foreign policy, and transatlantic cooperation on China. And we actually already had invited her to come to Freiburg at that time, but we had scheduling issues, so we're very happy that she made it here virtually tonight. She's also a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the Advisory Council of the US-Europe Alliance. Her research focuses on transatlantic relations, great power competition, and authoritarian challenges to democratic states and institutions. Welcome, Torrey Taussig. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabina. Guten Abend alles. Ich freue mich hier zu sein, zu diskutieren unser Thema Europe's role in US-China competition. I will now switch to English so you can all understand me, but it is very nice to see you all, and I'm sorry we cannot be together in person. Unfortunately, I have never personally been to Freiburg, which is a shame, but hopefully we can correct that in the future. So as Sabina mentioned, the topic of our conversation tonight is on US-China competition and Europe's role in an increasing era of what I would call great power competition. And I want to leave enough time for conversation and questions, and so I will go through a few prepared remarks, and then please feel free as I'm talking to write comments in the chat or to raise your hand, and then at the end of the comments, I hope we can have a robust back and forth and conversation. So to start off, I would like to make 4 big points that will kind of thread through the rest of my remarks. The first major point I see in this topic is that managing competition and cooperation with China will be one of the most important foreign policy issues for the US and Europe to get right in the years ahead. And as part of this point, I will go over what I see as some of the major and evolving challenges we face from China today. The second major point is that US and European assessments of the challenges posed by China in trade, technology, global governance, I see as having really converged in recent years. And we are on both sides of the Atlantic, I think, on the more of the same page now than we really have been in recent years when it comes to China policy. So that's the second point. We're really seeing a convergence of assessments and how we look at China. The third point is that while some differences will remain in how the US and its European partners view the China challenge and view the best way to deal with China, I think the Biden administration presents a new opportunity for the US and Europe to work more closely together on a range of issues, but also in particular together on China. And I'll go over a few reasons why I see that to be the case. And the fourth point, which kind of takes me to the point in this discussion where we will look ahead, is that I do not think we need, as transatlantic partners, nor should we implement an anti-China agenda. I do not see us in a new Cold War paradigm. And rather, I think both sides of the Atlantic should advance together an agenda of what I would call democratic resilience, a positive, forward-looking agenda that seeks to strengthen our institutions, our networks, and our values at home and on the world stage. China is a part of this conversation, but I do not think we need to move forward as an anti-China coalition. And I'll go over a few policy ideas that I try to write about for a Washington, D.C. or a European policymaking audience. So those are the 4 major points I'll try to get across today. But to start off as we move forward. So what are the challenges that we face on both sides of the Atlantic from China? In looking at Chinese domestic politics over the last few years and its approach to foreign policy, I would say that China's global role has changed since former leader Deng Xiaoping called on the country to bide its time and hide its light and ensure that other countries did not seek to balance against China. Today, we're facing a very different Beijing under President Xi Jinping, where China has become more assertive abroad and what I would say is increasingly authoritarian in many ways at home, even though China, of course, has always been a communist country in its modern era. So what are these challenges that we see from an increasingly assertive and authoritarian China? We've seen China take aggressive actions against its neighbors in the East and South China Sea. At home, it has been carrying out a significant military, professional, and modernization program. in terms of spending, personnel, and hierarchy. We've also seen domestically, and this is a big issue in the news today that we can of course get into, but the detaining of over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang and the repression of other ethnic minorities across China in what the United States government under the Trump administration and the Biden administration has referred to as a genocide. Again, abroad, we've seen a Beijing become more confident and an aggressive global actor through its massive Belt Road initiative, not all negative on this front, but certainly in debts recipient countries through different initiatives. And we've seen a China that's more vocal in shaping the agenda of multilateral institutions, whether that be the UN Human Rights Council or the International Telecommunications Organization. China is trying to advance its own values and interests on the world stage, as all of our countries do, but that I think we're seeing is to the detriment of our own interests and values as it does so. And it's been interesting to watch China's role both in its own neighborhood and in the West, in the US and Europe, over the course of this COVID-19 pandemic. Just in watching China's diplomacy throughout Europe, it was interesting to see how its improvisation of providing of masks and PPE was accompanied with a pretty aggressive brand of diplomacy and influence operations, spreading conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus, vocally criticizing European responses to the virus. And then closer to home, I mean, I think that the CCP was taking advantage of international distraction almost in this time of the pandemic to impose a new national security law in Hong Kong that's really stripping away this entity's democracy, autonomy. It has carried out a fatal border dispute with India, and it has increased tensions with neighbors in the Indo-Pacific, including Australia. So I think particularly over the last few years, for all of these reasons, in all of these illustrations, we've seen a China that is more aggressive, more assertive, more authoritarian at home and abroad, which calls for a new policy line from both US and European policymakers. And I go through this kind of laundry list of illustrations for a reason. I mean, not to paint China as this all-consuming, 10-foot kind of all-encompassing problem, but to say that the shift in US policy and the shift from European policymakers is happening for a reason. And those reasons really originate within China and from the CCP rather than originating in Washington as a way to contain China's rise. I mean, I think we have to be clear-eyed about the way that challenges have changed from China and how we are responding in kind. So that's a first point. But I think despite China's more assertive and aggressive actions, this is not the time for our governments to be carrying out new Cold War postures. Sometimes we hear this kind of Cold War-esque rhetoric from Washington, and it's met with a sense of nervousness from European capitals. But I don't think it's time for a new Cold War, nor do I think it's possible. And this is primarily because our world is increasingly interdependent. I mean, I'm sure this fact is not lost on anyone here that we are all in our living rooms right now affected by the same transnational challenges, whether that be pandemics or, the next existential crisis down the road, climate change, nuclear proliferation. We all rely on the health of one another's own economies and economic prosperities for our own economic prosperity and safety. And in this interdependent world, China is a major engine of economic growth. It was the only major economy that grew throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, it comprises almost 20% of the world's GDP, 18% to be exact. That's a fundamentally different paradigm than what the Soviet Union was operating in during the Cold War. Just earlier this year, Beijing surpassed the United States as the EU's largest trading partner. And so that economic interdependency is felt very deeply on the European side of the Atlantic. And I think this is an appreciation that the Biden administration comes into office with, and that is that China will also be a central player and a central solution maker in tackling transnational challenges such as climate change, pandemic recovery, preparedness, and arms control. We need a strong, responsible China at the table to deal with these transnational issues. So for all of these reasons, we are operating in an incredibly complex environment where we are seeing a more aggressive and assertive China, but it is not one where we can operate with containment or Cold War policies in response. And therefore, this gets back to my first point, managing competition and cooperation with China will be one of the most important foreign policy issues for the US and Europe to get right in the US, to get right in the years ahead, excuse me. So moving on, how has the US approach toward China hardened in recent years? This is one of the few policies, I think, moving from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, where we will actually see a fair amount of continuity. The Trump administration's approach toward China was a little frenetic in that it pursued unilateral, kind of hawkish trade war type policies toward Beijing on its own without consultation to allies or even European partners. It did not view China as a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And this is one that I think will continue under the Biden administration. But that, as we've already seen is the case, the Biden administration will look to approach alongside allies and partners rather than in a unilateral relationship with Beijing. It is not just a view held at the executive level, taking a more hardline, kind of tougher approach to Beijing as well. Sorry, Sabina, I just got a note saying that my internet's unstable. Can you still hear me? Okay, great. I will continue. So the taking a tougher approach toward China is something that we have bipartisan consensus on in the Congress, and also one that the US public is really coming around on. And today, actually, just in a recent Pew poll, we saw that over 70%, 73% of Americans have a negative view of China. This is something that has increased throughout the pandemic. It is hard to, I think, extrapolate where these negative views come from, but it is a view that I think congressmen and congresswomen are paying attention to, and that is something that's felt in the American public. Going back to more of the government level view towards China, I think since Obama left office, there is a sense that the impression of China being a responsible stakeholder in the world and that engagement with China was going to serve US interests, this type of prevailing perception has really fallen by the wayside. And when Obama left office and the Trump administration came into power, we saw on the national security side of things, both the 2017 National Security Strategy document and the National Defense Strategy both define the US-China relationship in terms of what these documents referred to as geopolitical competition across every aspect of the relationship: economic, technological, political, security, to really see this relationship in a fully competitive light. I think this new administration has taken more of the approach that we also need China at the table in a cooperative framework in order to solve big issues like climate change and arms controls and pandemic recovery. But this sense of all-out competition that we've seen kind of ingrained at the executive level remains. And I recognize that this is not a view that Europeans hold as closely as the United States does. And I think this is in part because the US views China as a major military competitor in the Indo-Pacific due to its military modernization efforts, its illegal island building campaigns in the South China Sea, and its aggressive actions in that neighborhood against US allies and US resources and military itself. This is simply not a region that Europe is as most intricately involved as the United States is. And I think that's clear and that's understandable. So moving from the military standpoint of the US-China competitive framework, I think the biggest area we're seeing this play out in now is in the field of technology. And we've seen over the last decade or so, the United States government issuing a series of export controls to ensure that US sensitive technologies do not fall into the hands of Chinese military end users. We've actually seen Europe come on board with some of these export controls, but at the same time, towards the end of the Trump administration and moving into today, we've also seen the US government cut off access from the Chinese to US technologies. And so competition is really shifting from the physical world of military resources and ships in the South China Sea into this all-encompassing technological digital world that we live in. And I'll go into this a bit later, but I think technology is a conversation that we can have where we're really seeing competition play out today. So that's where I see US-China competition moving from the Trump to the Biden administration. I'll just say a few more points on how the Biden administration has approached China early on. Biden has said that he will focus on not, again, countering China, but on focusing, strengthening international rules of the road. He's even called for, President Biden has called for extreme competition. That says something, I think, but is also seeking to avoid conflict at the same time. And members of the Biden administration have already come out pretty forcefully in criticizing China's economic and human rights policies. And in President Biden's first phone call with Xi Jinping, this was in early February, President Biden was very vocal about raising concerns on Chinese coercive and economic practices, Beijing's crackdown in Hong Kong, its human rights abuses in Xinjiang. I mean, these are all in the call transcript. You can see that these conversations were top of mind and they were discussed openly. Also, China's more aggressive stance toward Taiwan. President Biden wanted to make very clear that the United States stands with a Taiwan that's free of coercion from Beijing. At the same time, talking about this relationship of competition and cooperation, they also discussed shared challenges: the COVID-19 pandemic, global health security, climate change, preventing weapons proliferation. These were all issues on the table to ensure that moving forward, even if we're operating in an environment of extreme competition, call it that, that the US is committed to pursuing what the administration called practical, results-oriented engagements with China, and importantly for our discussion today, coordinating policies toward China with allies and partners as really a centerpiece of Biden's foreign policy agenda. So I'll pause there for a second just to say this is where I see the conversation shifting in Washington toward China. There are, to recap, a number of through lines from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. However, Biden has already clearly come out of the gate showing that he is more interested in working hand in hand with partners in Europe and Asia to manage this incredibly complex relationship with China and take on shared challenges together. That was just not rhetoric nor policies you saw from the previous administration. So moving to the other side of the Atlantic, how have Europe's policies toward China evolved? This was an issue that I focused on when I was based in Berlin as a Bosch Fellow in 2018 and 2019. And I was lucky enough to have the freedom to run around government agencies and the Bundestag and the Auswärtiges Amt and ask questions about how Germany in particular was viewing evolving challenges from China. And it was fascinating to see this shift happen while I was there. But my takeaway, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion as well, is that in recent years, Europeans have in fact grown more skeptical of the Chinese Communist Party's behavior at home, around the world, and in Europe. If we go back almost 2 decades to 2003, this was when the European Union announced it was launching a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. This policy, this approach was meant to elevate EU-China ties beyond trade and investment to show that Europe was interested in working with China to solve some of the world's most pressing security and policy challenges. Now, over time, in recent years, I think that this relationship has disappointed Europeans in many ways, particularly in terms of access to China's market. The Communist Party's kind of flouting of human rights violations. We've also seen forced technology transfers between European companies and Chinese companies. And frankly, on the technology front, outright cyber and cyber attacks and IP theft that have left many Europeans and many European policymakers being more skeptical of its relationship with China. And actually, when I was in Berlin in March of 2019, so almost 2 years ago to the day, the European Commission released a new white paper that simultaneously defined China as a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. So looking at China in all three of these capacities for managing the relationship going forward. And I think that, and I bring this up now, even though this was a paper released 2 years ago, because I think this is the prevailing perception, at least at the EU level, for how policymakers look at their own relations with Beijing in this three-part approach: partner, competitor, and rival. There's no one size fits all, no geopolitical competition to define every aspect of the relationship in the way that Washington may be approaching Beijing, even under the Biden administration. So I think that might create some differences in approach that we can talk about in a moment. But since the release of this white paper in 2019, we've actually seen the European Union take steps to strengthen its own hand vis-a-vis Beijing, but also other external actors, and to help Europe be a more capable actor on the world stage. So we've seen the EU create a chief trade enforcement officer position. The EU has launched a strategy for strengthening EU competition laws for companies that want to access the common market to ensure that European companies are not put at a disadvantage. China plays a lot into that, given the state subsidies of its own companies. The EU has developed a framework for an EU-wide mechanism on investment screenings. Europe still, I think, has a way to go on this, because only half of EU member states actually have investment screening mechanisms to ensure that there's government oversight when a company tries to come in and buy a majority stake in what might be a security or sensitive critical industry. So that is, I think, moving along. And on the controversial but important issue of 5G, we've also seen the EU create a toolbox and steps to strengthen and address 5G related security risks. So I bring all these up because I think in the last 2 years, we have really seen the EU and European member states take steps to strengthen their own hands against ever more encroaching Beijing, but also against other great powers, perhaps the United States, and we can talk about this issue of European strategic autonomy as well. And we've also, just as a final point on the European steps toward China, it's been interesting to see, pretty strong remarks from European officials toward China. For example, EU High Representative Josep Borrell saying that he believes that, quote, the West was naive with regard to China. And NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg saying that, and I have a quote written up here from him, in the world of great power competition, where we see China coming closer to us from the Arctic to cyberspace, NATO needs a more global approach. And we've actually seen in the last few years, NATO actually looking at China as part of its security portfolio, as part of a challenge that NATO thinks it needs to take more seriously closer to home. This is not to say that NATO is moving towards the Indo-Pacific, but I think NATO recognizes that China is playing a bigger role in its neighborhood, and it needs to have a posture towards that. Also at the EU member state level, where some might criticize Germany for having kind of mixed messages on China, Germany has constantly offered safe harbor to Chinese dissidents. Both France and the UK in particular have indicated strong opposition to Chinese human rights abuses. They've been putting, I think, a bit more resources into restricting freedom of navigation operations in the Indo-Pacific. Up in the Nordics, Sweden has gone relatively far to curb authoritarian influences by terminating Confucius Institutes and city partnership programs with CCP-funded programming, where it was hard to discern if home institutions within Sweden were able to carry out its own sense of academic freedom and programming. And even in Central Europe, where we've seen countries be pretty reliant on Chinese investment, for example, Czech Republic or some of the Baltic states, even these countries For example, Lithuania and others have intensified their contacts with Taiwan in order to ensure that their interests are not being taken advantage of in the Indo-Pacific as well. So I think this all shows that while the EU has been strengthening its hand throughout these number of steps at home within the European Union level in creating these institutions and mechanisms for strengthening the common market, we've also seen EU member states take somewhat tougher lines as well. That all being said, it's of course, I think, a bit more of a mixed bag when we look at Europe's approach toward China, and there will always be that kind of tough economic leverage that China has over smaller European countries. Beijing's ability to work bilaterally through forums such as the 17+1 that are still capable of dividing Europe. And we have seen some European countries, for example, Greece and Hungary, that have been able to block statements by the EU on condemning, for example, China's human rights records or aggressive actions in the South China Sea. So divisions remain, but we have seen a Europe that has grown tougher and more consistent on its China policies. So that brings me to my final set of points. Looking forward, where can US and European partners work together on China, and where might obstacles remain? I think in general, just in looking at the first few months of the Biden administration, there is a sentiment and an inclination to want to work together, to overcome transatlantic differences that we had under the Trump administration and further back, to say that we are in a new time, we face new serious challenges, and we need to work together if we are going to strengthen our shared interests and values. And I think it is clear where President Trump's approach toward Europe did drive a lack of unity of transatlantic cooperation on issues such as China. I mean, we saw the previous administration take a very combative approach toward the EU, particularly towards Germany, which was often in the bullseye of the administration's foreign policy criticism. The United States withdrew from multilateral institutions of significant importance to the EU, such as the Paris Climate Accords, the Iran nuclear deal. And I think in many ways, it made these actions made China appear a more reliable partner in addressing some of these very critical environmental and security challenges. So similar to other aspects of the transatlantic relationship, this loss of trust and cooperation between the US and Europe has really inhibited a transatlantic strategy on China. Now that President Trump has left office, it's clear that this was only one of the reasons that there was a lack of cooperation. Often, I think if we're honest, he was a convenient excuse for not taking steps that Europeans did not see it in their own interest. And of course, there are deep divisions that remain across and within EU member states on how best to manage this trifecta of the relationship with Beijing between rivalry, competition, and partnership. And then we will always see this issue of, I think, economic leverage playing a role. And final point before I talk about a few policies where I think we can work together, just because this has been in the news recently, but the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the CAI, has really made headlines in Washington, I think primarily for the politics and optics behind it. I mean, this was a trade deal that the EU and China had been working on for 7 years, did not really seem to be making a lot of progress. And then at the last minute, due to concessions from China, this deal was struck despite calls from incoming National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to kind of hold off and wait for time to coordinate. I'm not here to say whether this was the right approach to take or not. I think in many ways this was a trade deal that looks a lot like the phase 1 trade deal that the Trump administration finalized with the Chinese, but I do think it's hard to get around the poor timing and optics of this trade deal on the eve of a new administration in Washington starting that was looking to enhance our joint economic leverage vis-a-vis Beijing. So I think this deal was, again, unfortunate in timing. It highlighted that we will have divisions across the transatlantic alliance, if you will, on economic issues, but that fortunately, there are still several areas of cooperation between the US and Europe on China that the CAI, the investment agreement, does not preclude. So this gets me back to an earlier point about why, even though we need to work together, it is not necessary that we pursue an anti-China agenda. And I think instead we should be focusing on a transatlantic agenda on China that focuses first and foremost on democratic resilience, on our own democratic resilience at home, but also in our ability to speak with a common voice on shared values abroad. And there are many policy areas we can talk about where I think, we might need more coordination, whether that be on investment screenings or export controls or trade, but I would like to highlight here 3 sets of policies that I think fill out a transatlantic agenda of democratic resilience. First, I think that we should be looking critically at our cyber and our technological defenses and setting standards in emerging technologies and AI to protect against authoritarian influence and interference that we see from a Chinese digital authoritarian model, but also from cyber attacks and intrusions that we see from other authoritarian countries such as Russia. Technology is as I mentioned earlier, is going to be a critical area for competition with China. It's an issue area that I think has been dominated by disagreements between the US and Europe on issues such as 5G and whether to allow Huawei, China's major telecommunication firm, to build out European 5G networks. I think those disagreements may remain, but below the surface of this kind of headliner conversation, I really do see shared interest between the US and Europe in ensuring that artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, quantum computing, biotechnologies, that they are made safe for democratic use and that they're not being used for authoritarian purposes and facial recognition in ways that allow governments to infringe on citizens' privacy. We absolutely have data privacy differences between us in the US and Europe, and that's something that we can discuss. But I think at the base level, we have more values and interests shared in technologies that should help build cooperation in areas such as R&D efforts and exploring ways to train AI algorithms, boost defenses against counter AI techniques, and investigate efforts to kind of infiltrate our own systems vulnerabilities. It will get technical very quickly, and I am not a tech expert by any means, and so I will not go too far down this road, but I do see in the transatlantic conversations that I'm a part of with policymakers and in the think tank community that technology is where democracies in Europe and Asia should really strengthen its cooperation. And I think that there is a genuine interest from the Biden administration to work with European partners on focusing on this set of issues. So that's one on the technology front. The second, where I think we need to build more cooperation and an agenda of democratic resilience, is in speaking with a collective voice on human rights and democratic freedoms. I think we both have an interest and a value in strengthening our democratic institutions at home, but we also have a value in an interest in speaking out when these values are violated abroad. And one tool through which to do this that we've actually seen employed just last week is through these relatively new Magnitsky Act legislations that the US, Canada, the UK, and the European Union have all passed that allow for the freezing of assets, the imposition of travel bans on individuals involved in serious human rights violations and abuses. And just this month, just last week, these pieces of legislation in each of these national and supranational contexts were employed in a coordinated fashion against Chinese individuals involved in the internment of Uyghur ethnic minority group in Xinjiang. I found this to be a positive signal that we can work together on addressing human rights violations and speaking out with one voice. And I actually think that this is an area where we could enhance cooperation in response to, for example, China's efforts to undermine Hong Kong's democracy and autonomy, and also the aggressive actions that we're seeing Beijing carry out in the South and East China Sea, by together urging that stronger legal measures take place in international courts. I bring these up because, again, I think that we have tremendous power between our countries if we use our collective voice for speaking out where we see human rights violations take place, and also an infringement of international norms and rules of the road. The final area I'll mention where I think we could enhance cooperation between the US and Europe is actually in working with Asian democracies and democracies in the Indo-Pacific to uphold the rules-based international system. And it's been interesting to see over the last few years, Europe shift its gaze towards the Indo-Pacific. France was the first European country, to release its own Indo-Pacific strategy in 2018. Germany followed just last September in 2020, announcing that it would send a naval frigate to the Indo-Pacific this year in 2021. And most recently, the United Kingdom released its integrated security and defense review, stating its ambition to engage deeply in the Indo-Pacific. So this focus from transatlantic countries, I think, should create more opportunities for cooperation between the world's leading democracies in Europe and in Asia, whether that be South Korea, Australia, Japan, India, despite the domestic challenges that it's going through. And one interesting area we could see this play out is in this year's G7 meeting, which is taking place in June in the United Kingdom, where UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has actually suggested inviting Asian democracies to the forum to have a more concrete discussion about democratic resilience and cooperation on an issue like technology. And he's in particularly invited South Korea, India, and Australia to join. So that's one area I think where we're already seeing cooperation between European and Asian democracies potentially move forward. But I also think on the trade front, this is where we can really boost our economic leverage over Beijing and get what we would like out of bilateral trade deals. We can accomplish more when we're doing this together. And one area where I think there's room in the year ahead is at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, that the Biden administration has signaled it is willing to work through as opposed to around in the way the Trump administration did. And I think this is a forum where the US, Europe, and for example, Japan can enhance current cooperation and bring forward joint cases that address unfair Chinese trade practices. So again, I think we only enhance our leverage in ways that can affect Chinese decision-making if we work hand in hand with US, transatlantic, European, and Asian democracies. So I will close it there. I would welcome any of your comments and questions about this agenda of democratic resiliency. Again, I hope you don't think I'm painting an anti-China agenda or a new Cold War strategy. I don't think either will work, or that's the world that we operate in, but I do see it in our shared value and interest to enhance and strengthen our democracies at home and abroad, and how we work with and push back against China is fundamental to this agenda.
Thank you very much, Torrey, for this talk. I would open the floor now for questions. So if anybody has a question that they want to ask in person, please feel free to turn on your microphones now, and very happy to take them. Okay, I have a question in the chat that we can start off. Maybe we can take the conversation from there, and other people will also join us with questions. So here's a question. Joe Biden suggested starting a similar project to China's One Belt, One Road recently to Boris Johnson, apparently. Do you have an idea on how this should shape up? Especially if the Chinese initiative is to be countered on a multilateral basis?
It's a great question, and it's one that has been playing out at the nexus of development and security in both the United States and in Europe, I think. The EU a few years ago launched its EU-Asia connectivity strategy. The US has launched its own, what it calls Blue Dot Network, to enhance financing and transparency around development projects abroad. The UK clearly is looking to enhance its own development strategy as a way to counter China's Belt Road Initiative. And I think this is going to be a critical area for cooperation in the years ahead, particularly as China tries to advance its own influence in developing countries. That often comes with, as I mentioned earlier, kind of debt traps from time to time, and also the acquisition of technologies by recipient countries that are used to then surveil or censor their own publics. And so I think it's of critical interest to democracies to work together on these types of parallel investment and financing structures. That being said, I'm glad that it's becoming a bigger focus between our governments now, because it certainly needs more political will and more financing and more cooperation across our countries in order to ensure that we can counter what is, I think, over $1 trillion already invested through BRI from the Beijing standpoint. So it's an important area. I would like to see more conversations like the ones happening now between our heads of state, because again, it does, these parallel structures and financing routes will need more political will and financing to be successful.
Okay, great. Thank you. There is another question. First of all, thank you for such a fascinating talk. I can agree on that. The person is asking, could you speak a bit more about the Magnitsky Act, and has it been used in the past to address human rights issues? How effective do you think it could be in the context of the Uyghurs specifically? Difficult word, sorry.
No, it's a great question, and it's been interesting to see on both sides of the Atlantic, at the EU level, Canada, the United States instigate its own Magnitsky Act. These were pieces of legislations named after, I believe it was a Russian human rights lawyer who kind of perished in a Russian jail under skeptical terms that the United States and other countries then named its own anti-corruption, anti-human rights legislations after. And they have been used against human rights violations carried out by Russians and others. I think this context of using this legislation against the Uyghurs has been, in the context of the Uyghur crisis, is probably a useful way forward for these pieces of legislation. If you look at who has actually been sanctioned by these pieces of legislation, they are regional, local elites involved in the Security Bureau in Xinjiang province, where these over 1 million ethnic minorities are being detained and re-educated and held. And to talk about the impact and whether these will actually be effective in countering human rights violations, it was really interesting to see the Chinese response, particularly in the European context, to employing this Magnitsky Act. So in response, the CCP sanctioned 10 European individuals, many of whom were European parliamentarians, Reinhold Bütikofer from the European Green Party, who's originally German, and others, and then other European entities such as MERIX, which is a Institute for China Studies based in Berlin. And you know, the retaliation, I think, shows that this legislation has hit a nerve in China, and that it is worried about these types of coordinated approaches being used in the future. I'm not sure it was an incredibly effective response from Beijing, because it's really put at risk the investment agreement that has to be ratified by the European Parliament in order to take effect. So I think a big implication has been the stumbling block it's created for the investment agreement. But that all goes to say, I think this legislation has struck a nerve, and that it shows we can use this type of human rights violation legislation in a coordinated fashion that gets the violators of those human rights, that gets their attention and causes them to respond. So, you know, whether it's capable of changing the massive system and programming that's underway in China, I'm not sure. I think there's going to be a lot of dynamics to play out over the years ahead, but it has certainly garnered the attention of the CCP in important ways.
Okay, great. We have another really, really long question, or more of a comment. And I'm wondering if the person actually wants to ask this question themselves and let us hear it. Would you be willing to speak up?
That's okay, sorry.
That's okay. Ooh, I think we cannot hear you well. Torrey, can you hear her well?
I can't, but I do see your question in the chat. So
No. Ooh, sorry.
sorry, Amanda, but I do. If you want to type anything else, feel free to type your question further. And to follow up, I see Walter's question on the challenges investments of General Motors and Tesla are facing in China. And I think both of these questions get to the role of corporations in this kind of values-based competition that we're seeing, and the boycotting of Xinjiang cotton, and then also the national boycott that's taking place in China of some of these multilateral corporations. And we're seeing that corporations are caught in the crosshairs of government sanctioned legislation. And Amanda, you're right. I mean, these corporations these companies are largely autonomous. And I think at the end of the day, these companies are going to be driven by their bottom line. And if they see that their consumers do not want to be buying products made from forced labor in a region that is rife with human rights violations, I think they'll change their practices and the way that they produce and manufacture and sell their products. I don't want to sound Pollyannish or naive about the extent to which corporations' behavior will change, but it is interesting to see these corporations caught in the crosshairs. And we are seeing some of these corporations respond in ways that they think are affecting their bottom line, because consumers in the long run may not be that happy about buying products that are involved in these type of environments. How will this affect the conduct of trade at the state level? I mean, I can say in terms of positive trade relations, so on the counter to the sanctions front, I mean, in many ways, it was German corporations and industries that really got the China-EU investment agreement over the finish line. And so I think we've seen corporations really driving strong positive relations between Europe and China. And now we will be seeing, I think, on the flip side, what happens when these corporations and their bottom lines get caught up in what are state-to-state disagreements. Final point I'll just make, I mean, we've seen European companies be bullied by Chinese, state media and diplomatic outlets where, I think it was Daimler a few years ago that sent out a tweet in support of the Dalai Lama. And then all of a sudden you had the China state media machine turning against Daimler, saying that they were going to boycott their products. And I think it was Daimler, correct me if I'm wrong and anyone else knows. But I mean, we have seen the Chinese state take very strong actions against corporations that stand out and speak out against Chinese national interests, whether that be on Tibet, Taiwan, or now in Xinjiang.
Okay, great, thank you. We also have another question that was posed to everyone. Biden has promised to position the US as a reliable partner and to increase multilateral cooperation, yet his administration left the previous administration's COVID vaccine. Now I can read the rest.
It kept the export restrictions in place.
Thank you.
The US currently is not shipping any COVID vaccines abroad. And certainly not to the extent, I mean, we've seen the EU send some of its vaccines abroad. I think India is one of the major exports of vaccines, and the United States is not on that level. I think that this is something that can change in the months ahead. I mean, it's definitely been a domestic push to achieve Biden's early pledge of 100 million shots in the first 100 days, which I think they've already surpassed. And personally, just from a citizen standpoint, I'm not speaking as an analyst here, but I can see us having a significant vaccine surplus in the months ahead, especially if you have a certain percentage of the country that's not willing to get vaccinated. I mean, again, this is just me kind of watching the news, and I think that might lead to the exports of surplus vaccines. But yes, and the UK is on a similar level as well, using vaccines for domestic purposes first. But I do think we might see this change over the coming months. And one important shift that the Biden administration made in its vaccine distribution was in rejoining first the World Health Organization, and then also signing up to COVAX, which is this initiative, I believe it was started by the Europeans to raise funds for and ensure an equitable distribution of vaccines to developing countries. The US has thus far under Biden pledged $2 billion, with $2 billion more likely to come. So that was an important shift, I think, that signals this administration's interest in getting vaccines around the world and getting them out quickly.
Okay, thank you. I have another geopolitical question that is based on the new deal between Iran and China, which I think most of you probably have heard of, which says that China will make big investments in Iran over 25 years in exchange for oil. And that was certainly alarming to the US because also the Middle East was always preoccupied by the US, so to speak, and it was a dominant power in the Middle East. Could you comment on that? Because I've also read that Biden wanted to start negotiations again or start a conversation with both China and Iran, and both said, we're not going to speak to you before you don't lift the sanctions. So do you think that also the Trump administration kind of has destroyed the relationship so much that it will be very difficult to get back into a conversation, and that maybe the US even needs other international partners to start that conversation again?
It's a fantastic question. It's a really complex situation. And I feel that even the question itself answered a little bit of what was posed in terms of how the United States needs to be working with allies and partners at this time to compete with China and regional actors like Iran, not because the United States necessarily is doing this outreach in altruistic ways to make allies and partners feel better. The United States is doing this out of necessity as well. I mean, we do not have the commensurate economic, political, or military leverage to deal with great powers on the world stage today, whether that be China, Russia, or regional actors like Iran, if we are not working hand in hand with our partners. And this strategic pact that China and Iran has signed, this 25-year, I think it's $400 billion pact, it includes provisions for joint weapons development, intelligence sharing. I mean, this is as frontal as a challenge to the US-led rules-based order as it gets. And so we are going to need to work with allies and partners in dealing with, for example, the Iran nuclear issue, managing competition and cooperation with China, and the fact that these significant powers like China and Iran are moving forward with their own cooperation, I think just presents the realities of the day. I mean, it's clearly a challenge that's staring us in the face, and it's one that, again, goes against how I think the US would like to see the rules-based order play out, but it's one we can't strengthen on our own, that we need the European partners to work alongside with.
Okay, great, thank you. I have one last question that was directed to me. Everyone always talks about the technological aspects of competition being the most important, but looking at how Chinese have started dominating infrastructure in Africa, train lines, etc., isn't it maybe just as relevant to look at such geopolitical aspects as well, or even more so?
So it's a great question, and I'm sometimes hesitant to look at every railroad project and every bridge that's built under the guise of geopolitical competition. I think that China is doing extensive amounts in the developing world in the field of infrastructure, in financing this infrastructure, in building out technologies. And it's not all bad, nor should it all be countered. Where I do think it's important for the US and Europe and like-minded partners to lean in is where we see these countries becoming indebted to China's economic leverage, or we see political alignment starting to shift away from strategically important countries in the West to valuing those relationships with Beijing in ways that hurt our own interests and values. So I think we need to be judicious about where we are looking to counter aspects of China's BRI, where we want to provide again, transparent and greater financing to developing countries that want this type of transparent financing. But I think it's a reality that we face that's not all bad, that China is a significant infrastructure builder and financer around the developing world, and it shouldn't be countered at every front, but we should, as I think democratically like-minded partners, be able to provide these countries with more than one option.
Okay. There's one last question, and then I think we will close the discussion for tonight. That is, critics on human rights issues happening in China seem to be only in lip service at the moment. How far do you think would the US and Europe go in order to put more weight on their criticism?
Mm-hmm. And then I see a point that just came through on Taiwan that I'll try to address.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Closing point. It's, I think the initial kind of execution of these Magnitsky Acts toward Chinese individuals and entities involved in Xinjiang is a really important first step that shows that we as partners are not just going to stand up at the UN or make strongly worded statements with no bite behind them. I think in general, at least in the US, human rights policy has been promoted through sanctions, perhaps a little bit too heavily. I think there's other ways we can push these values as well. But I'm hopeful, given that these coordinated Magnitsky Acts were implemented recently, even in a way from the European Union perspective that put this investment agreement at risk. So I think we're moving beyond lip service. How far we go in terms of the infringement of democracy in Hong Kong or China's aggression toward Taiwan, I mean, these are really complex issues that are going to play out over the next few months, I think. And again, this is where our joint leverage speaks a lot stronger than us issuing strongly worded statements on our own. And it actually leads into this point on Taiwan. The Biden administration invited a representative of Taiwan to its inauguration. It has come out with some pretty strong statements thus far on its interest in seeing a Taiwan not pressured by the CCP. And I mean, if the United States does not come to the defense of Taiwan, I think in the case that there were to be a cross-strait attack from the mainland, I think US credibility in the Indo-Pacific would be null and void. The more I hear about Taiwan from people who really focus on this issue, the more I think that onus is on Beijing, and they recognize the risk calculation that goes into any sort of assertive or aggressive act against Taipei. So I still don't see Beijing, at least in the near term, inclined to, for example, launch a cross-strait attack because they know the massive global response it would incur. And again, that scale of risk reward is probably far higher on the risk side now. But again, I think it's important to say the right things right now, show that we are, standing on the side of Taiwan and try to maintain that risk reward balance in a way that Beijing does not see as favoring further aggression.
Thank you so much, Torrey. This was amazing and very informative, and thank you so much. There was another comment, but unfortunately, I think we're going to close it for today. You can follow Torrey on Twitter, and I'm sure she's happy to have a small Twitter conversation with you there. Thanks so much to the audience for being here. We will take a small Easter break now, but we will be back with our Transatlantic Tuesdays right after the Easter break, and we will start on the 13th with a reading and conversation with the author Hari Kunzru, Red Pill and the Dangers of Everyday Dystopia, which is going to be very interesting and exciting topic to speak about. We will, Felicitas, my colleague, will share all the information where you can also register for our next events for the next Transatlantic Tuesdays. And I wish all of you a great evening, and want to say thank you again, Torrey, for being here and for sharing all this info. There's also more in the chat if you guys would like to copy that and open the links so that you have them to read later. Have a good night, everyone. I will say happy Easter already. Enjoy the vacation. Hope a lot of you will have a few days off maybe and some time to enjoy this beautiful weather. Good night.
Happy Easter. Stay healthy. Talk to you soon.